Apartheid-era South Africa is often discussed as an internal struggle, but it's actually a powerful story of continent-wide solidarity. Many African nations, leaders, and ordinary citizens played important roles in weakening the apartheid system and supporting South Africans. Here are some of the most significant contributions. Frontline states, the immediate neighbors. Several nearby countries, often called the frontline states, bore enormous costs for supporting the anti-apartheid struggle. Zambia became a major base for the African National Congress, ANC. Despite economic and military pressure from the apartheid regime, Zambia hosted activists, training camps, and political offices. Tanzania provided diplomatic, military, and ideological support. Dar es Salaam was a key hub for liberation movements across Africa. Mozambique after independence. Mozambique supported South African freedom fighters and suffered destabilization campaigns and cross-border attacks as a result. Angola played a strategic role by resisting South African military incursions and indirectly weakening apartheid's regional dominance. Zimbabwe offered sanctuary and political backing for liberation efforts. These countries paid heavily, economically and militarily, for standing against apartheid. Political and diplomatic pressure across Africa. African states used international institutions to isolate apartheid South Africa. Organization of African Unity, OAU, coordinated African opposition to apartheid, funded liberation movements, and pushed global anti-apartheid resolutions. African governments lobbied the United Nations for sanctions, arms embargoes, and diplomatic isolation of the apartheid regime. Many countries severed trade and diplomatic relations with South Africa, despite economic losses. Economic and material support. Financial aid and resources were provided to the ANC and other resistance groups. Scholarships and educational opportunities were offered to South African exiles. Safe passage, passports, and refugee protection were granted to activists. Moral and symbolic solidarity support was not only governmental. African societies showed deep solidarity. Universities and communities welcomed South African students in exile. Pan-African media amplified anti-apartheid voices. Cultural and intellectual networks sustained morale and legitimacy for the struggle. Military and security support. Some African countries provided training grounds for guerrilla fighters, logistical and intelligence assistance, arms and operational support. This was extremely risky, as the apartheid government frequently launched raids into neighboring states. Influential African leaders. Certain African figures were especially influential. Julius Nyerere, a leading advocate for liberation movements. Kenneth Kaunda, central to ANC operations in exile. Samora Machel, strong supporter of anti-apartheid forces. Muammar Gaddafi provided material support to liberation causes. Why this matters? Apartheid's collapse was not achieved by South Africans alone. It was shaped by a broader African commitment to decolonization, racial justice, and shared destiny. Many nations sacrificed stability, security, and economic growth to oppose apartheid. Nigeria, one of the strongest anti-apartheid voices, Nigeria positioned itself as a leading opponent of apartheid, both in Africa and globally. Its involvement went far beyond symbolic gestures. Major financial support. Nigeria provided substantial funding to South African liberation movements, especially the African National Congress, ANC. Nigeria was among the largest state contributors to anti-apartheid causes. It financed liberation activities, international campaigns, welfare for South African exiles. At one point, Nigeria even introduced a special national levy known as the Southern African Relief Fund, SRF. This fund mobilized resources specifically to support freedom movements in Southern Africa. Education and scholarships for South Africans. Nigeria opened its doors to South African students fleeing apartheid. Many received university scholarships, full sponsorships, living support. This was critical because apartheid severely restricted Black South Africans' access to quality education. Diplomatic and political pressure. Nigeria was a relentless force in international diplomacy. Aggressively pushed anti-apartheid resolutions at the United Nations, played a leading role in the organization of African unity, championed sanctions, embargoes, and global isolation of the apartheid regime. Nigeria's diplomatic corps became famous for its uncompromising anti-apartheid stance. Economic and cultural boycotts. Nigeria enforced strict measures against apartheid South Africa, blocked trade links, refused sporting contacts, denied South African legitimacy in international forums. Nigeria also pressured other countries and corporations to cut ties. Support for exiles and activists. Nigeria hosted South African activists and provided travel documents, safe haven political backing. Prominent anti-apartheid figures spent time in Nigeria for organizing and advocacy. Why Nigeria's role was so influential. Nigeria was not a neighboring state, yet it acted with exceptional intensity. Several factors amplified its impact. Oil wealth enabled large financial contributions. Large population gave political weight. Strong Pan-African ideology guided foreign policy. Nigeria came to be seen as one of the most steadfast international allies of South Africa's liberation struggle. Appatheid was resisted not only at home, but by a broad African coalition, and Nigeria stood near the very front of that effort. A bit of historical irony. Despite African enormous support, post-apartheid relations between the countries have sometimes been strained, often due to migration, crime perceptions, and diplomatic tensions. This contrast between historic solidarity and modern friction is a fascinating subject in African political history.